Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having an amazing day and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. Today, I'm going to be sharing a watercolor painting tutorial that's perfect for beginners just getting started, and I'm going to be breaking down my painting process for developing light, glowy paintings that have dimension into 5 simple steps. We're also going to be practicing essential techniques such as wet on wet, wet on dry, light scrubbing, and layering. We're going to be bringing in masking fluid, which is such an essential tool to start learning about and exploring. And this is going to be a great opportunity to practice our color mixing and our development of values in order to develop higher levels of realism. So without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight in. Right here, I just finished up with my preliminary sketching process, and I'm just lightening up my sketch a bit with my kneaded eraser, just doing gentle tapping over my sketch there, removing any excess graphite that might be floating around on my paper and lightening up my sketch a little bit because I don't want my pencil lines to show through my paint at the end. I'm going to be leaving the link to the reference photo that I used for this piece down below in the description box in case you'd like to download it and use it to create your own preliminary outline sketch so that you can work alongside me. All right, so before getting started with the painting process, I'm gonna do my masking. And for this particular illustration, I'm gonna be masking out the colorful candy sprinkles on top of the donut so that I can paint the donut freely and not have to worry about covering up those little shapes that I want to add different colors into later in the last stages of this painting process when I'm working on details. Meaning I want those little small shapes that I'm going to be painting later on with different colors to remain white until the end. This is why I'm masking them out. I'm blocking them to keep them protected while I'm working on the pink throughout the donut. After I am done painting the pink throughout the donut and developing all of those major pink values, highlights, midtones, and darks, I'm going to allow everything to dry, and then I'm going to go ahead and remove the masking fluid, and I'll be painting in the candy in those white sections of paper. All right, so what you're seeing me do right here is I am starting to place my masking fluid, and yes, I am using a toothpick. I honestly like using alternative tools to place my masking fluid, and this is because I have ruined paintbrushes by using these paintbrushes with masking fluid. I have created an entire video with masking fluid tips that I'm gonna make sure to leave down below in the text section of this tutorial so that you can go and check it out, learn about masking fluid, the do's and the don'ts, so that you can avoid accidentally damaging your artwork or damaging your tools and all that kind of stuff. Masking fluid is liquid latex. It dries pretty fast and it can completely ruin your paintbrushes if you're not careful. And yes, there are certain methods that you can use to protect the bristles of your paintbrush, like coating them with soap and different kinds of methods like that. But honestly, I'd rather just avoid that, and this is why I like using alternative tools like toothpicks, paper clips, old toothbrushes, etc., depending on the effect that I am going for. So all I am doing right here is I am applying my masking fluid with the tip of my toothpick. I am pressing down my toothpick kind of sideways so that the entire side of the tip of my toothpick is coming into contact with my paper and creating that elongated shape instead of having just the tip touch the paper, which would create more of a dot. I poured a bit of masking fluid into this extra little plastic lid that I had in my art supply cart, and that is where I'm taking my masking fluid from. I am applying my masking fluid in these little rectangular shapes that I had created with pencil. I will say though that when I am sketching in those final smallest details at the end of my preliminary sketching process, oftentimes I change those smallest details. I'm not trying to copy what I see in that reference photo, especially when it comes to those smallest details. I know that as long as I use the values present throughout the main structure of the donut, and as long as I respect and bring in that main information present in the reference photo, that is going to allow me to arrive at the level of realism that I want in that major structure, I can change these smallest details. I can remove sprinkles, I can bring in sprinkles, I can change the color of the sprinkles, and it's still gonna look realistic. So I just kind of took the main characteristics present in the sprinkles in the photo. So their size, how they are rotating in different ways, how they are clustering together in different ways, overlapping sometimes, and that kind of thing, and brought them into my sketch. And you can also bet that as I am placing this masking fluid, I'm adding more little shapes than I actually had in my sketch. Or maybe some of those little shapes that I sketched in, I didn't actually go into at all. It's really not necessary to create a carbon copy of every single thing that you see in that reference photo in order to arrive at higher levels of realism, as long as you know what to look for, which really, as I've shared in past videos, value, lights, midtones, and darks, is number one in order to create a higher level of realism in anything that you're trying to draw or paint. What's also important is that you acknowledge what you're drawing or painting as having a three-dimensional form. It's a three-dimensional structure that has volume to it, that is made up of different planes, some of which are facing towards the light, some of which are facing away from the light, and bring in your understanding of light behavior, right, as you're drawing and painting this. Otherwise, you may run the risk of your drawing or painting looking flat, and it's not going to look very realistic. So if you take those values that you're seeing in that reference photo or whatever it is that you have in front of you in real life, and you bring these things to mind, you're going to arrive at higher levels of realism. Even if you paint more loosely and incorporate a certain level of abstraction into your piece, even if you change colors present, and even if you change smaller details. The bigger the amount or the larger the blob of masking fluid you create, the longer it's going to take to dry, but usually it dries pretty quickly. The way that you know it's completely dry is you're going to notice that it looks a little bit yellowish and it looks rubbery, and it feels rubbery to the touch. It's no longer sticky. And another thing that I want to mention is I know that for a lot of beginners, masking fluid can be kind of frustrating to use because too much can drop down your tool, whether you're using one of those a pen applicators or a paintbrush or something like what I am using. A lot of it can drip down all at once, or not enough is coming down, and it can be quite frustrating. And so learning how to place your masking fluid effectively takes time and practice. And I also know that it adds an extra step to the process, but I promise you that it is such a helpful tool to start learning about and exploring, because when we're painting with watercolor, we have to plan and protect our highlights and lightest value areas where we want to leave that white paper shining through completely unpainted, or we want to have plenty of that white showing through that very light, pale, translucent color. When we're trying to develop higher levels of realism, we need to develop a wide range of values. We need our highlights, we need our wide range of midtones, and we need our darkest darks. And if we don't plan for our highlights and don't protect those lightest value areas, it's very likely that we're going to arrive at a flat looking painting. And so by bringing in masking fluid, it's just a helpful tool that will enable us to work more freely and not have to feel like we're walking on eggshells and having to very carefully work around our highlights that we want to keep protected and not paint over, because those sections are masked out for us, so we're able to paint more quickly, which working more quickly often helps us also arrive at fresher looking results. And finally, masking fluid is also great because it can help us create different textures, such as wood and fur, in a relatively easy way. Right here, I'm sharing a couple of examples where I used masking fluid in different ways. In this one, I used masking fluid to mask out blades of grass and also little white flowers. In this one, I used masking fluid for a few different things. It helped me describe that wood texture. I also used it for the fox's fur, and I also did some experimental splattering for visual texture and interest. So I cannot recommend starting to practice with masking fluid enough. Even though it adds an extra step or two to the process, you're ultimately going to spend the same amount of time or less working on your piece because it enables you to work faster. And you're also going to be opening up your horizons and learning tricks and tools that are going to help you add awesome effects into your pieces. After having placed your masking fluid, it's important to allow everything to dry completely before getting started with the painting process. All right, so moving on to my selection of colors and my preparation of color mixtures. I'm going to be using 7 different colors for this piece, and these are all colors from my Daniel Smith palette. These colors are quinacridone rose, pyrrole scarlet, neutral tint, phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, Hansa yellow deep, and burnt umber. You do not have to use these same colors to arrive at great results. I'm going to be swatching out my color mixtures for you on a scrap piece of watercolor paper so that you can use whatever you have on hand that's most similar and you're still going to arrive at great results. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with the kind of main color of this piece, which is going to be, of course, the pink. I'm going to be creating a nice looking pink by mixing together Quin Rose and Pyrrole Scarlet. Quinacridone Rose by itself looked a little bit too cool for me, and I wanted a little bit of a warmer pink. So I added a little bit of a warmer red into the Quin Rose, which was my Pyrrole Scarlet, and I like this pink a lot more. Right here, I'm going to swatch out the plain Quin Rose for you so that you can see what it looks like on paper. And right below it, I'm going to swatch out the Quin Rose plus that Pyrrole Scarlet. Notice how much warmer it looks after I've added in this warm red. I continue shifting and changing, adding more of one color or the other color until I arrive at a nice base pink that I like and I feel is a little bit closer to the hue that I see in that reference photo. I make sure to create a nice juicy puddle of this base pink color on my color mixing palette. I want to make sure that there is a good amount of color saturation or pigment in my color mixture and also some amount of water in it. So I would say this is somewhere between a coffee to milk-like consistency of this color on my palette. And once I've arrived at a pink that I like, and I have a good amount of it already on my palette, I go ahead and test out this mixture at its lightest and most pale and translucent. And I also test it out at its most saturated. I want to know what this color looks like at its different values that I'm able to create on its own, meaning by adding more or less water into this mixture or by simply taking more of that paint in a more saturated state with my paintbrush or taking a smaller amount of paint. When we're working with watercolor, we can create a wide range of values of one same color by simply adding more water into our color mixture. However, with a lot of colors, you can only get so dark. And as I said before, we need to create our darkest values in order to give this donut dimension. So oftentimes we're going to have to add in another color to darken the mixture even further. So in this case, I decide to go with the neutral tints. I create a second puddle of the same combination of colors, my quinacridone rose and my Pyrrole Scarlet in this lower section of my mixing area, and I go ahead and add a little bit of neutral tint to darken it even more. You can darken colors pretty quickly by adding in your neutral tint, black, Payne's gray, or whatever you decide to add. So make sure that you only add a little bit at a time, and if you feel you've gone way too dark, simply add in more of your other two colors, more quinacridone rose and Pyrrole Scarlet, and that is going to lighten it back up. Also, I would recommend keeping these color mixtures separate. You can see them as being your lighter value color mixture at the top and then your darker value color mixture at the bottom, but try to keep them separate because if you want bright pinks in the majority of your donut and you want to keep those pinks nice and bright and vivid, you don't want any black or gray to go into that pink. And also, while you're painting, make sure that you only use those darker pinks that have the neutral tint or the Payne's gray or whatever it is that you've added in to make it darker. Make sure that you're only using that color mixture in the darker value areas and you're not bringing in this color into lighter value areas. Otherwise, you're going to darken everything too much, and you're going to take away that brightness and that freshness that we're looking to maintain in the lightest pink value areas and also mid-tone areas. All right, you guys, it's time to move on to the first part of this painting process, which is going to be developing our lightest pinks. I don't know if you noticed this, but I did map out a couple of large highlight shapes in that preliminary outline sketch that I'm going to make sure to keep protected during the painting process. These are areas that at the end of the painting process, I want little to no paint in. I didn't mask them out like I masked out the little tiny sprinkles because they are much larger, and because they are much larger, they are way easier to work around. Alright, so what I am doing here is using my size 12 round brush, I am starting to paint in a very light, very translucent, very pale layer of pink all throughout my donut, except of course for those large highlight shapes that I mapped out for myself. I'm taking just a little bit of my lightest color at a time, so my Quin Rose plus Pyrrole Scarlet mixture that I have on the top section of the palette there, just bringing out a little bit of color at a time, and I am using plenty of water that I'm bringing out from my container to soften it and expand that small amount of color into this large area in order to make sure that everything looks very soft and very pale. It's important to work quick, and also I am making sure to go over everything with just water in my paintbrush quite a few times very gently, because I want to make sure that everything stays nice and wet for the value development that we're going to be doing next. The way that I made sure that everything stays wet as I continue making my way towards the left edge of the donut, because I decided to start at the right, is I advance a little bit towards the left and then I go back to where I started to run my paintbrush bristles over that area again. Then I go back to where I had left off, I advance a little bit more towards the left, and I go back to where I started again to run my paintbrush bristles over that section again. Then I make my way closer to the left and I go back to where I started again, and so on and so forth until I reach the left edge. Then I go over everything a few times again to make sure that I arrive at a nice even wetness all throughout this pink shape. It's very important that I spend time on this initial very light, pale, translucent pink layer, because if I do this too quickly and certain sections of this pink shape start drying on me, I'm not going to be able to create the soft, diffused out transitions that wet on wet allows when we paint with watercolor, which is what I want for the next phase of the painting process. So take your time with this initial layer. I cannot recommend that enough. Just make sure that you are using paintbrushes that are intended for watercolors, which usually have soft bristles, and be very gentle as you're running your paintbrush bristles over this entire shape, so that you don't affect the sizing of your paper. All right, so I'm almost done here. You can see how I have my highlights and I have my lightest pink values already developed. Right here, I'm turning my watercolor paper up towards the light so that you can see this nice even wetness, this nice even sheen that I have created before starting to drop in my next layer of paint. It is now time to get started with what I would consider to be phase number 2 of this painting process, which is where we're going to start developing the pink midtones and darker midtones. So what I am doing right here is I am continuing to use my size 12 round brush, and I'm starting to drop in more of this first lighter color mixture that is my mixture of Quin Rose and Pyrrole Scarlet, but I am now dropping it into this first layer that is still wet in a more saturated state, meaning it's less watered down and I'm dropping in more pigment than I was initially dropping in. So you can see how this pink looks a lot darker than the pink that I was initially creating, even if this is exactly the same color mixture, but this is because I am overlapping that color on top of a previous layer, and as I said, I'm dropping it in a more saturated state. It's a little bit thicker, and I'm also dropping in way more color, applying it a little bit more freely than how I was before. And you can see how, because that initial layer is still quite wet, I'm getting nice diffused out soft transitions between my pink values. Once I had taken it a step darker with that same color mixture, I am now going to be using my darker color mixture. So my mixture of Quin Rose plus Pyrrole Scarlet plus a little bit of neutral tint is what I am going in with at this point. So I'm now getting into the darker midtones, taking it a step at a time incrementally towards my darker values, working from lights to darks. As I am developing all of these different values throughout my donut, which value is number one when it comes to developing a sense of 3D-ness, of realistic light and shadow, I am observing that reference photo, and I'm also bringing to mind what I know to be true about the structure of this particular kind of object. If we don't think of the subject or the object that we're shading as a voluminous structure that is composed out of different planes, some of which are facing towards the light and other planes that are facing away from the light, and that this is something that has mass and volume to it and it's not flat, then it's very likely that even if we're able to develop a variety of values, there's still going to be flatness in our piece. So using my reference photo for clues, I take note of where the darker values are throughout this donut. I get an idea of where the light source is hitting this donut from, which, seeing that reference photo, I get the sense that the light source is located somewhere above the donut and slightly more to the left than to the right. You can also get a pretty good idea of the location of the light source if you take note of the cast shadow below or around the object or the subject, because the light source is usually opposite to the cast shadow. In this case, I can tell that the cast shadow is to the right of the object. So this tells me that the light source is somewhere above the object and more to the left. This is especially the case when you have just one single light source. When you have multiple light sources or a photo is over or underexposed, it can get a lot trickier to tell the location of the light source, which is another reason why it's so incredibly important to choose a great reference photo to work with. So knowing this, the darker value areas, shadowy areas are going to be along the right edge. And when it comes to the donut hole, I see in the reference photo more dark values along the left edge than along the right edge. I did drop in some darker pink along the right edge though, because I knew that that would help me create more of a rounded out, raised look for that middle part of the donut. I made sure to keep everything very irregular and very abstract. I like acknowledging all of these different value shapes as abstract, irregular shapes. And I also stayed away from the look of outlines or very blocky, drawn out shapes. I also only dropped in the darkest pink where I really needed to darken sections, and I left plenty of the lighter pinks shining through in lighter value areas uncovered with the darkest pink. All right, I'm all done here. You can see how I now have highlights. I have very light pink areas where you have plenty of that white bright paper shining through. I have lighter midtones and I have darker midtones, and I have nice soft transitions between my different values. Now, watercolor tends to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So later on, I'm going to go back in and I'm going to darken darkest dark areas, but this time on dry paper. Okay, so it's now time to allow everything to dry completely. Usually I would say that you can help yourself with a hair dryer to speed up the drying process, but because there is masking fluid on our paper, you can run the risk of that masking fluid attaching or adhering to your paper more strongly when you bring in a heat tool. So that's not something I would necessarily recommend. I would say allow this to dry naturally and come back to continue with the next part of the process when everything is completely bone dry. Okay, so at this point, everything has dried. You can definitely see how this has dried a lot more lightly. That is perfectly okay because I'm going to go back in with another layer to darken certain sections later. Before moving on to the next part of the process, what you're seeing me do right now is I am using my size 10 round brush to do gentle scrubbing along the edges of these bright white highlight shapes that I left protected in that first part of the painting process. So what this does is this softens the edges of those stark white highlight shapes. Just by going in with a tiny bit of water in my paintbrush and doing gentle scrubbing along those edges, this softens the edges and the highlights become softer and maybe even smaller. This step is not 100% necessary. If you like those sharp defined edges around your highlights, you can leave them the way they are. And if you decide to do gentle scrubbing, just make sure that you are gentle. You don't want to start damaging your watercolor paper. All right, so I'm all done with that softening. I allowed everything to dry there because I did use a tiny bit of water. And it is now time to move on to phase number 3 of this painting process. This phase is all about deepening and darkening and pushing contrasts in darkest value areas. And because we're going to be painting on dry paper now, that color is not going to expand out into any wetness. And because it's not going to expand out, this is going to help us create darker values. Because we're going to be painting on dry paper, you're going to be left with sharp defined edges around these shapes that you're painting in. So if you want to soften those edges, all you have to do is remove the color from your paintbrush bristles and go back in with a clean and only slightly damp paintbrush and run the bristles of your paintbrush along the edge that you're looking to soften. I would, however, advise against trying to go in and soften everything out, because if you do, you can run the risk of overworking your piece. So only go in and soften edges when you actually need to. I like having a combination of soft edges and sharper edges in my pieces. As I am working on these darker abstract shapes, I continue observing that reference photo and taking note of where the darkest dark areas are throughout the donut. This is where I'm creating these darker abstract shapes. And there is no need to be overly precise about getting each and every single one of these shapes in and making sure that everything is exactly the same as it is in the photo. As long as these shapes that you are painting in are in the approximate location that you see them in the reference photo, the approximate size and the approximate shape, you will end up with something that looks realistic. So even though I'm using a reference photo, I'm trying to keep things abstract and relatively loose. So because we're working on darker midtones and darkest darks, we're using plenty of that darker color mixture, but feel free to create a transition mixture. You can always bring in some of your lighter mixture into your darker mixture, or some of your darker mixture into your lighter mixture to create a transition color in between the two. For me, it is important to go step by step towards darker values. I don't ever want to go in with a super dark, thick color mixture on top of a very light pink value. That is going to create a lot of contrast. And I like to keep things subtle and work my way incrementally towards the darker values. So you can create your in-between color mixture, then work that in, paint in that shape, and then go in with your darkest color mixture and paint in a smaller, darkest shape within that larger mid-tone shape. As a general rule of thumb, the darker and more saturated I get with my color mixtures, the smaller the shapes that I paint in. I only darken the sections that need to be darkened. This helps me create nice, glowy, light paintings that still have a lot of dimension to them. Remember that it's all about expanding the range of values and not covering up those lightest values where you want lighter value areas to be. If you cover up lighter value areas, you're going to be taking away from that range of values and not adding to the range of values, and that's going to start flattening things out. So I'm just finishing up here. After I finish with my larger shapes, you're going to see me go in with just a teeny tiny amount of translucent lighter color mixture to create smaller abstract shapes throughout the donut, which helps me create a little bit of an irregular texture throughout the icing of the donut. Just a little bit goes a long way. I'm pretty happy with the range of values that I've developed. I managed to darken certain sections even more wet on dry. And it is time to allow everything to dry completely once again, because we are then going to be removing our masking fluid and we're going to be working on the colorful sprinkles. Okay, so what you're seeing me do right here is I am using my index finger and I also use my thumb to remove that masking fluid, and I did make sure that everything was 100% completely bone dry before attempting to remove my masking fluid. And if you don't like using your fingers to remove the masking fluid, you can definitely use a rubber cement pickup. I always have very, very dry hands, and I make sure to wash my hands before I use them to remove my masking fluid, so that I don't run the risk of depositing hand oils or any dirt or graphite or paint on my painting as I am doing this. Okay, so you can see how I have uncovered all of these little white sections where I'm going to be painting in the sprinkles. And with this, we're ready to get started with the next part of this painting process. It is now time to start preparing my colors that I'm going to be using for the colorful candy sprinkles. I'm going to be using Phthalo Blue to create my blue sprinkles, Hansa Yellow Deep to create my orangish sprinkles. I'm going to be creating a purple for purple sprinkles by mixing together Ultramarine Blue and Quin Rose. And finally, I'm also going to be preparing a gray by mixing together Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Umber. And this gray is for my white sprinkles. By mixing together equal amounts of brown and blue, you're gonna get a gray. So go ahead and play around with the ratios of your blue and brown in this gray color mixture until you arrive at a gray. If you have more blue than brown in your color mixture, it's gonna look like a dark blue. And if you have more brown than blue in your color mixture, it's gonna look like a dark brown. All right, so I'm going to take a quick second to swatch out these colors that I've created for my sprinkles on my scrap piece of watercolor paper so that you can see what they look like on paper and choose colors that are similar to these, or you can even choose colors that are completely different from mine. It's totally fine. Okay, so this is where I use my smallest paintbrush that I have chosen for this painting process, which is my size 3 round brush. And I did make sure to change my water just to make sure that these colors came out nice and bright and relatively clean. And I'm gonna make my way through these colors one by one. So I'm first gonna be painting in the blue sprinkles, then all the purple ones, then all the orange ones, and finally I'm gonna paint in the grays for the white sprinkles. I really love this particular palette for this kind of work because it has these rectangular wells that have slopes in them. So whenever I want to take just a very small amount of paint, I can take that paint from the upper part of the slope. And when I want to take more saturated color or more color in my paintbrush bristles, I take that paint from that lower part of that slope where the majority of the paint is pooling. So for this case, because I am painting inside of very, very small shapes, and especially in this first part, I want to go in with just a small amount of light, translucent, pale color for each one of these colors that I am using, I am taking a little bit of paint from the top part of that slope. So just like with everything else that I've been doing, even for the sprinkles, I am first going in with pale, light, translucent color. I'm not even trying to perfectly fill in that entire little rectangular shape created by the masking fluid. I am jumping around and just painting in a little bit of color into each one of these white shapes. And I am incorporating any little white sections that I didn't perfectly paint in as part of the piece as little highlights in each sprinkle. So there's really no need for you to go in super perfectly and try to fill in those shapes super well, because any little slivers of white paper that you leave in each sprinkle will end up looking like highlights. Even when painting in these sprinkles, I am making sure to go in with a pale translucent color, and then I allow that to dry. And then what I'm doing right now is I'm going in with a little bit more color and darkening certain sections within that larger, lighter shape. I left even more paper uncovered for the white sprinkles. But it is important to add in at least a little bit of gray into the white sprinkles to give them a bit of dimension. This makes it so that the sprinkles look a little bit more realistic, because even inside these teeny tiny little elements in this donut, I am bringing in a variety of values, meaning I have little highlights, I have sections that look lighter and paler, and I have sections that look darker. And you can see how I jumped around and did this pretty quickly. So again, I made my way through the colors once to paint in that paler, more translucent layer. And then I went through that same order of colors once again, starting with the blue to paint in those smaller, darkest shapes inside each sprinkle. Of course, make sure to completely rinse out your paintbrush bristles in between your colors if you don't want to contaminate them. To take this even further and make these sprinkles look even more believable and add more realism to the piece, I'm going to add a little bit of cast shadow along a side or an edge of many of these sprinkles. So just like what I was mentioning when we were doing our shading and value development throughout the donut, what I was talking about in terms of making sure that you're having the three-dimensional structure in mind for whatever it is that you're shading, and you're having light behavior in mind, and how certain little structures impede that light from hitting other sections of the structure and create a shadow on it. Well, same thing is happening here. These little sprinkles are teeny tiny three-dimensional structures that are sitting on the donut. So because they are three-dimensional structures and they have mass and volume to them, well, even though they're very, very tiny, they create a teeny tiny shadow on the donut because they are blocking that light from hitting that tiny section of the surface of the donut. And so by adding in just a quick little brush stroke along one of the sides of most of these sprinkles, using my lighter pink or my darker pink, depending on the section of the donut that I'm going to be painting this shape on, I really raise up those sprinkles and make them look even more 3D, adding greater realism to this piece. I did try to add in this little shadow shape to the right of the sprinkles whenever possible to keep the light situation in this piece consistent. Remember that we're going to be adding the cast shadow in just a bit along the right side of the donut because the light source is on the upper left. I did this all with my size 3 round brush. I made sure to go in with either my lighter pink color mixture or my darker pink color mixture, depending on where I would be painting in this cast shadow shape. If I was adding a cast shadow shape on a very light pale underneath pink value, then probably it's best to use the lighter pink color mixture. But if I'm adding in this cast shadow shape for the sprinkle on a background area that has very dark pinks developed, well, it's probably not even going to be visible, so I'm going to go with the darker pink color mixture. And this is in order to avoid that very stark kind of distracting contrast that you can accidentally create when you paint in a very dark shape on top of a very light value background. Okay, so I'm continuing to jump around to add in those final cast shadow shapes. And with this, I'm going to be all done with this phase, and we're going to be moving on to the very last step in this painting process, which is going to be adding the donut's cast shadow, which is going to also help add realism to this piece, because through creating that cast shadow on the surface that the donut is on, we really situate this object in place, and we're able to further communicate that mass that the donut has, because that mass is impeding that light from hitting certain sections of the surface beneath it. For this last part of the process, I switched on back to my size 12 round brush. This is definitely a larger shape that I'm going to be painting in, and I want to be able to do it quickly. So initially, I go in with the gray that I created by mixing together my ultramarine blue and my burnt umber. I go in with this color mixture in a very watered down state, and I go in and paint in a very abstract, irregular shape along the right side of the donut. And I soften that pale gray even more by going over it with just a little bit of water in my paintbrush and pulling that color out a little bit more towards the right, expanding that shape even more, so that when I dropped in this next darker gray right here, that darker gray had space to expand out more towards the right and around the donut, creating a nice soft gradient with soft diffused out edges. And if you want to darken that section closest to the donut, which would be the occlusion shadow area, you can drop in more of your gray in there to darken it even more. Just make sure to keep it moving and do it while that initial lighter gray layer underneath is still wet if you want those soft diffused out edges. A lot of this process is just me going in with a little bit of water in my paintbrush, especially in the outer section of that cast shadow if I want to soften anything out, and then coming back to see if I want to darken that section closest to the donut, and I drop in more paint in there. And right here, just to finish up, I'm going to be adding a little bit of a shadow inside of this donut hole, which of course I have to add shadow in there, otherwise it would look pretty weird if I didn't. And I did the same thing. First I went in with lighter pale translucent gray, and then I dropped in a little bit more of my gray nearest the left edge of that inner circle. And just to finish up this piece, and this is completely optional, if you like the way that your cast shadow looks just with the gray, you can leave it as is, but I'm dropping in a little bit of pink on top of that gray while it's still wet. And because I made sure to drop it in on top of that wet gray, this creates very interesting colorful blooms where that pink merged into that gray. This adds a little extra pop of color and a bit more of an experimentational look to the piece. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited, they are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops. All have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.